Some people wear their sacrifice in silence, and others carry it inked into their skin. When a weathered woman tried to pay for her groceries using a military discount and was met with snide dismissals and rolling eyes, no one thought twice. That is, until an older man at the back of the line noticed the ink on her arm, the kind of mark that only a very specific and elite unit ever received. It was the tattoo that once brought fear to enemies and deep respect to the few who knew what it meant. Within minutes, the air in that quiet store shifted. People who had brushed her off began to realize who they were standing beside. And the woman who had been treated like she didn't matter was about to remind everyone what quiet strength really looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Long before she stepped into that store with a reusable canvas tote and worn-out sneakers, Eleanor Ramos had lived lifetimes most civilians would never imagine. But now, her hair was streaked with silver and usually tied in a simple bun at the base of her neck, and her clothes were the kind you could pick up in a thrift store for under $10. She didn't look like someone who had once commanded high-risk operations in hostile territories or stood guard in deserts halfway across the world under blackened skies and burning heat. She looked like someone's tired grandmother, maybe a retired schoolteacher, with soft eyes and a quiet gait. That day, Eleanor had only come in for coffee grounds and a small carton of milk. She didn't expect to be noticed. She never did. In fact, she preferred it that way. The grocery store in question was a modest neighborhood chain just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of those places where everyone vaguely knew each other, where gossip passed faster than the checkout beep, and where young employees often treated the elderly with a kind of detached indifference, unless they were someone's grandparent. Eleanor had lived just 5 blocks away in a modest one-story home she'd inherited from her mother. Her daily life was simple: morning walks with her dog, tending to the tomatoes and herbs in her backyard, and stopping by the market when supplies ran low. She didn't ask for much, but there was one thing she made a habit of using when it was offered: her military discount. Not because of the savings, it barely amounted to a few dollars, but because it was a small acknowledgement, a quiet thank you from the world that too often forgot what it had asked of her. The clerk behind the counter was young, probably no older than 22, with a name tag that read Kyle and a tired expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. As Eleanor reached the front of the line and set her items on the counter, she handed over her military ID along with her credit card. Kyle glanced at it, frowned, then pushed it back toward her with a smirk that made her gut twist. "We're not supposed to take expired military IDs," he said, loud enough for the people in line behind her to hear. "This looks ancient. Did you actually serve?" He chuckled, as if it was some sort of joke, and the young woman bagging items beside him snickered without looking up. Eleanor didn't respond right away. She just blinked, slowly, her face unreadable. Her ID wasn't expired. It was a special issue that didn't have an end date because her service had classified status. But that wasn't something she could explain to a part-time cashier in the middle of a store. She simply reached into her wallet, pulled out a few more dollars to cover the difference, and stood waiting while they finished the transaction. People in line behind her shifted impatiently, some whispering, others just watching with casual detachment. No one offered to intervene. No one said thank you for her service. She had grown used to it. But near the end of the checkout line, leaning on his cart with quiet composure, stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a pressed collared shirt and slacks. He looked to be in his 60s, with a closely cropped white beard and an unmistakable posture, military straight, eyes always scanning. His name was Major General Walter Donnelly, retired, though most never recognized him outside of formal settings. He rarely used his title anymore, choosing instead to live simply and anonymously, just like Eleanor. But as his eyes fell on the fading tattoo that peeked out from under Eleanor's sleeve, a symbol few even knew existed, one reserved for a covert operations unit from 2 decades back, his breath caught. He hadn't seen that emblem in years. It was a stylized falcon with angular wings, and a circle of stars burned into the skin with a precision ink that only certain personnel received, often without ceremony or public record. It wasn't just rare, it was sacred to the few who bore it. He stepped out of the line quietly, pushing his cart forward, eyes still on the tattoo. Something in his demeanor shifted, and people turned their heads as he walked toward the register, his steps heavy with purpose. Eleanor noticed him only when he was 3 feet away, and their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition in hers, but neither of them spoke. Not yet. Kyle, the clerk, looked up and raised an eyebrow as if expecting a confrontation, but what came next would be something that echoed far beyond the 4 walls of that little grocery store. Eleanor Ramos had never been one to draw attention to herself. From the moment she returned home from her final deployment, she slipped into civilian life like a shadow folding into dusk, quietly, with no ceremony. She was the type of person who entered a room without disturbing the air and left it without leaving a trace. Yet, beneath her composed surface was a life stitched together by sacrifice, precision, and grit that few could comprehend. Her story was not written in medals or ceremonies, but in calloused hands, sleepless nights, and decisions made in the darkness that others would never hear about. She had given her youth to a cause that demanded silence, discretion, and unflinching courage, and when it was all over, there was no parade, no welcome committee, only a seat on the Greyhound bus back to South Carolina and a duffel bag that felt far too light. She had grown up in a sleepy stretch of coastal Carolina, where Spanish moss clung to old oak trees and children played barefoot in the streets until the cicadas sang them home. Her father had been a fisherman, her mother a seamstress. They lived modestly in a home that smelled like salt and warm bread. From an early age, Eleanor was the kind of child who listened more than she spoke. She watched everything. The way her father's hands moved over the nets, the way her mother's eyes scanned fabric for imperfections, the way neighbors spoke to each other when they thought no one was paying attention. She learned early that power didn't always come from volume. It often came from presence, and Eleanor had presence, even when she didn't know it. She had enlisted at 19, driven less by patriotism and more by a need to escape. Her older brother had taken over their father's boat, and her younger sister was already married with a baby on the way. Eleanor felt like she was disappearing, as if her existence had already been plotted out by expectations she had no say in. The military offered her something no one else had, a chance to define herself, to become someone outside of what others assumed. It wasn't easy. The early years tested her in ways she never anticipated. She wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but she was meticulous, disciplined, unshakable under pressure. That steadiness caught the attention of a recruiter from a specialized intelligence unit, known only by a numeric code and a symbol she would later carry on her skin. Her deployments took her across continents, through deserts and jungles, into war rooms and outposts, tucked far away from headlines. Her job required silence, and she embraced it like a second skin. She became a ghost, an unseen hand steering delicate missions. Few outside her unit knew what she did, and even fewer would ever speak of it. She watched comrades fall, governments shift, and secrets exchanged like currency. It aged her, not in the way that showed on her face, but in her bones, in the weight of her stare, in the dreams that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night. She saw things she couldn't explain and carried burdens no therapist could ever fully unpack. By the time she was honorably discharged at 43, she had no spouse, no children, and very few ties left back home. She returned to Charleston, not because she was drawn there, but because it was the only place that still felt remotely familiar. Her parents had passed, and her siblings had scattered, but the small family home had remained, tucked between overgrown hedges and the whisper of Atlantic winds. She spent her days maintaining it with the same quiet determination that once carried her through foreign terrain. She didn't talk about her past, not to her neighbors, Not to the cashier at the corner store, not even to the pastor who occasionally waved from across the street. Most people assumed she was just another older woman living out her retirement in peace. She let them believe that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her only companion was an aging shepherd mix named Gunner, a rescue who had scars of his own. They walked together every morning before the sun rose, looping the same path through the neighborhood, stopping at the cemetery, where Eleanor always paused by the veterans section. She didn't know most of the names etched into those headstones, but she honored them just the same. Sometimes she brought wildflowers. Other times she just stood in silence, as if her presence alone could speak what words never could. Eleanor had no interest in recognition. She had turned down interviews, politely declined veterans ceremonies, and kept her medals tucked away in a cedar box beneath her bed. Her tattoo, the falcon in flight, wings sharp and encircled by stars, was the only visible trace of who she had once been. Most people never noticed it. The ink had faded slightly over the years, blending into the weathered texture of her forearm. But it was still there, still sharp to those who knew what to look for. She hadn't gotten it for vanity. It had been offered to her by her unit's commander during her last tour, an informal mark of respect, a symbol of loyalty and survival shared only among those who made it through. Despite everything she had been through, Eleanor never carried bitterness. What she had done with full knowledge of the cost. She didn't need anyone's applause. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the sunlight fell just right on the porch, or when Gunner curled against her feet as she read by the fire, she wondered if it had mattered. If anyone really remembered. If the lives she had helped save even knew she existed. These thoughts never lingered long. She'd swat them away like flies and return to her day, making coffee, pruning plants, feeding the stray cats that appeared near the fence. And that was why, when the young cashier at the store refused her discount, she didn't argue. She didn't shout or demand anything. She wasn't surprised. She had learned long ago that people often only see what they expect to see, and in her worn clothes and gray bun, no one expected to see a decorated covert ops veteran. That is, until someone who had once walked similar paths saw past the surface and remembered what that tattoo really meant. Charleston had always been a city of contrasts. Cobblestone streets and pastel-colored houses stood as living monuments to history, while new coffee shops and boutique gyms popped up on every corner. In Eleanor's neighborhood, the old world still clung stubbornly to the present. Her street, Barrow Lane, was lined with modest bungalows shaded by towering oak trees whose limbs twisted overhead like watchful sentinels. The sidewalks were cracked in places, softened by moss and time, and the houses bore the wear of generations. Porches sagged ever so slightly, paint peeled in quiet surrender. But it was home, the kind of place where no one locked their doors during the day, and the mailman still knew everyone's name. The people of Barrow Lane were a quiet, mostly older crowd. A few younger families had moved in over the years, drawn by the low property prices and close proximity to downtown. But the heart of the neighborhood beat in the routines of those who had been there for decades. Mornings were for porch coffee and waving at joggers. Afternoons saw gardening, light chores, and the hum of radio stations tuned to golden oldies. Nights were still, lit by the soft glow of porch lamps and the low flicker of TVs behind thin curtains. Conversations happened over hedges or in line at the local pharmacy. The community wasn't tight-knit in a loud, celebratory way. It was held together by subtle nods, shared habits, and the unspoken understanding that everyone had seen life unfold at its own speed. Eleanor's house sat near the end of the street, slightly elevated from the road with a patch of overgrown lawn she trimmed herself. A weathered rocking chair rested on her front porch, and a wind chime made from old brass keys tinkled when the breeze was just right. Her mailbox had been repainted several times, always in the same soft green, and her windows bore hand-stitched curtains that had once belonged to her mother. The fence in the backyard leaned slightly to one side, but Eleanor had no intention of fixing it. It leaned just enough to give character but not enough to fall, much like herself. About 5 blocks east sat the small grocery store where the incident would unfold. It wasn't one of the sleek, modern chains with polished floors and self-checkout kiosks. Instead, Delaney's Market had been around for nearly 30 years and showed every day of its age. The tile floors bore scuff marks no mop could erase, and the shelves, though well-stocked, had a slight tilt that made cereal boxes lean left like synchronized dancers. The fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly overhead, casting a clinical glow that clashed with the warm scent of fresh bread from the in-house bakery. The checkout counters were manned mostly by teenagers earning extra money or retired folks working part-time to stay busy. Management was indifferent, more focused on the weekly numbers than on customer experience, and turnover was frequent. The regulars knew what to expect and what to avoid. The discount rack near the back was always worth checking, and the third register, the one closest to the exit, was manned by the fastest cashier if you were in a hurry. Delaney's didn't cater to the elite. It was for people who counted their coupons and made shopping lists with pen and paper. It was where veterans, pensioners, and single parents did their shopping. Most days, it was uneventful. Customers came and went, exchanging pleasantries with familiar cashiers, or silently pushing carts past rows of canned goods and produce that wasn't quite as fresh as advertised. But every once in a while, tension would crackle in the air like static, usually brought on by some misunderstanding at the register or a dispute over expired discounts. On those days, everyone pretended not to watch. Their attention held just long enough to satisfy curiosity, then quickly redirected to their phones or shopping carts. Eleanor had a routine that rarely changed. Tuesdays and Fridays were her shopping days, always mid-morning, always the same items unless a special occasion called for something extra. She parked her truck, a battered, sun-bleached Ford, at the far end of the lot, away from the crowded center. She preferred the walk. It gave her time to scan the perimeter, check for new signs, unfamiliar faces, or the subtle details most people overlooked. Some habits never left, no matter how many years passed. She entered the store with a mental map of her route. Produce first, then bread, then coffee and dairy, with the final stop at the small shelf where discounted canned goods sat like forgotten soldiers. She rarely deviated. There was a comfort in predictability. But while Eleanor moved through the store with the ease of someone who had trained her body to be efficient, the world around her buzzed with a kind of casual detachment. The young employees joked loudly behind the deli counter. A mother scolded her toddler near the cereal aisle. 2 teenagers in oversized hoodies loitered near the entrance, pretending to shop while checking their phones. No one noticed Eleanor. Or if they did, it was only as a shape passing by, an anonymous figure in their periphery. She liked it that way. Blending in was second nature. Being invisible meant safety, control, but it also meant invisibility in every other sense. Acknowledgement, respect, remembrance. Those were luxuries given freely to loud personalities and familiar faces, not to quiet women with military posture and silent scars. The store manager, a balding man in his 50s named Dennis, had an office above the main floor with a glass window overlooking the registers. He rarely came down unless there was a problem, and even then, he preferred to handle things from a distance. His philosophy was simple. If it didn't affect the bottom line or create bad press, it wasn't worth the hassle. The younger employees followed his lead. Most were friendly enough but uninformed, indifferent to the finer details of customer service or military policy. Discount codes were applied inconsistently, sometimes forgotten altogether. And if a veteran raised a question, it was often met with a shrug or a vague excuse about needing manager approval. Outside the store, the world moved on as usual. Cars rolled lazily down the street. Birds chirped in the nearby trees. The sun beat down on the asphalt, reflecting off windshields and warming the air. And Eleanor, unaware that her mundane visit to Delaney's would soon unravel the quiet balance of this small, sleepy environment, continued her route with the same unassuming grace that had defined her for decades. But this was the kind of place where nothing happened, until it did, and when it did, everyone remembered. The conflict began not with malice, but with a smirk. Kyle Brennan had been working at Delaney's Market for nearly 6 months, and already, he walked through the store like he owned it. Tall, wiry, with a shock of blonde hair that never stayed under his cap, Kyle was the kind of young man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. To the managers, he was a dependable shift lead. To the customers, he was often brusque, sometimes condescending, and entirely unaware of how his attitude affected those around him. Kyle had been raised in a suburb 30 minutes outside Charleston, and while his upbringing was comfortably middle class, he carried himself with the air of someone who believed the world owed him more. Working at a grocery store wasn't part of his long-term plan. He was only there until he figured things out, as he often told coworkers during their cigarette breaks behind the loading dock. What made Kyle particularly problematic wasn't just his arrogance, it was his ability to mask it behind just enough charm to get by. With the right customer, he could flash a grin and offer a half-hearted apology, deflecting blame without consequence. He knew the store's policies only insofar as they served his convenience. Discounts, complaints, exceptions, those were things he handled based on mood, not rules. If someone pushed, he pushed back harder. If someone didn't push at all, he dismissed them without a second thought. His coworkers tolerated him because it was easier than confronting him. Management tolerated him because he showed up on time and didn't cause overt problems. But Kyle had a pattern, a subtle but distinct way of interacting with customers he deemed less important. Elderly patrons who fumbled with their wallets, tired mothers juggling toddlers, veterans who asked for discounts, all were, in his view, people who slowed the line and expected too much. And that morning, when Eleanor stepped into his line, he'd already had a rough start. He'd spilled coffee on his apron, been chewed out by Dennis for forgetting to clock in, and gotten a parking ticket outside the store for staying too long in a 30-minute zone. By the time she reached him, he was already annoyed, and she, with her quiet presence and simple items, was exactly the kind of customer he didn't take seriously. She greeted him politely, and he responded with a grunt, barely looking up as he scanned her items. Then she handed him her military ID. That's when his smirk returned. To Kyle, the card looked old, like something laminated back when computers still ran on floppy disks. He held it up, squinting as if reading a foreign language, before tossing it onto the counter like a discarded receipt. The military discount, in his mind, was reserved for the people who looked the part, young, upright, clean-cut men with buzz cuts and broad shoulders, not for tired-looking women with gray hair and wrinkled fingers. He leaned on the counter and made a show of examining the ID again, then slid it back across the surface with a dramatic sigh. When Eleanor, still calm and composed, offered to show him another form of identification, he waved her off. He told her, loudly enough for others in the line to hear, that the card looked fake and didn't match anything in the system. He even made a joke to the teenage bagger beside him about people trying to scam discounts they didn't deserve. The young bagger, Tessa, barely 18 and 2 weeks into the job, laughed nervously, not sure what else to do. She didn't know Eleanor. She didn't understand what the card meant or why Kyle was dismissing her. All she saw was a moment of tension she didn't want to be part of. She focused on placing the milk and coffee into a paper bag, eyes fixed downward, hoping the awkwardness would pass quickly. But for Eleanor, the moment dragged on like a weight pressing against her chest. She didn't argue. She didn't explain the tattoo. She simply reached for her wallet and pulled out extra bills to cover the full price. Her face remained neutral, though her hands trembled slightly, less from anger and more from the familiar ache of being underestimated, unseen, written off. Behind her, the line grew. Customers shifted their weight, tapped their phones and whispered. No one said a word in her defense. Kyle's words had created an unspoken verdict. This woman was not who she claimed to be. The discount was denied, and the moment moved on as if it were insignificant. But it wasn't insignificant. It was the culmination of years of being overlooked, of surviving things no one would ever understand, only to be met with skepticism in the most mundane corner of civilian life. Kyle didn't think twice about the interaction. As far as he was concerned, it was just another Tuesday. He processed the next customer with the same detached efficiency, unaware that the man who had stepped out of the line and walked toward the register was not just another old shopper. He hadn't noticed the posture, the way the man carried himself, or the gleam of recognition that had flashed across his face when he saw Eleanor's arm. Kyle didn't recognize the silence that followed as anything out of the ordinary. He didn't know that the balance of power in that small store was about to shift in a way he'd never experienced before. Because the man approaching wasn't there to shop. He was there because he had seen something he couldn't ignore. A symbol, a mark, a silent call to honor long buried beneath the noise of modern life. Kyle would later claim he was just following policy. He would insist he hadn't meant any disrespect, that it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew that the smirk, the tone, the assumptions, those were his own. And they were about to be challenged by someone who not only understood the truth behind that tattoo, but had once fought alongside people just like Eleanor. The kind of people who didn't ask for thanks but deserved it more than most. As the days passed, the incident at the grocery store refused to fade from Harper's mind. She replayed it in her head over and over. Each word from the cashier, each judgmental glance from customers behind her, each second of humiliation lodged in her chest like shrapnel from a war she hadn't wanted to fight. She had left that store with a bag of bread and some canned soup, but without a shred of dignity. Even after years of service in some of the most remote and hostile regions overseas, she had never felt so dismissed, so invisible, as she had in that suburban checkout lane. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once helped deliver food supplies to starving villagers halfway across the world, yet here she was being treated like she didn't deserve $2 off her groceries. The world she came back to didn't quite know what to do with someone like her. Harper had always struggled with transitions. Even before the military, she was the kind of person who needed a mission, a purpose. That's what had drawn her into the armed forces in the first place, a need to belong, to be useful, to be part of something bigger than herself. Back then, she didn't care much for rank or recognition. She just wanted to serve. She wanted to be the calm in the storm, the reliable one, the one people knew would follow through. Over the years, she became exactly that. Her teammates came to rely on her cool-headedness, her uncanny ability to assess terrain and situation, her endurance through harsh desert nights or days spent marching under the unrelenting sun. The tattoo on her shoulder, now so casually dismissed by a teenage cashier, had been earned through blood and fire. It marked her place in a recon unit so specialized that only a handful of people in the country even knew of its missions. Not because it was classified, it technically wasn't, but because it was the kind of detail that got lost in the sea of headlines and public debates. Her unit was the kind that got no media coverage, whose successes were celebrated only among themselves, whose losses went unnoticed by anyone but the families of those who didn't make it home. Harper remembered the day she got the tattoo. It was at a small outpost, tucked into a rugged mountainside overseas. Her unit had just completed a grueling operation, one that involved a week of stealth movement, evading detection, and gathering critical intelligence that later saved hundreds of lives. They weren't allowed to talk about it, not officially, but among themselves, they commemorated it with ink, simple, sharp, and symbolic. The tattoo was a black falcon wrapped around a dagger, its wings outstretched across her upper arm. Each line told a story, each feather a fallen comrade, each curve of the blade a mission completed. It was more than art. It was memory, honor, grief, and resilience etched into her skin. But none of that had mattered to the cashier, or to the manager who wouldn't meet her eyes, or to the customers who quietly agreed with the refusal. To them, she was just a woman in cargo pants and a hoodie, trying to shave a couple of bucks off her bill. To them, she didn't look like a veteran. That phrase bounced around her head often, what a veteran was supposed to look like. The truth was, she had seen hundreds of them in her years, women with prosthetics and kids at home, men with quiet eyes and deep trauma, people of every background and orientation. There was no one way to look like you had given part of your life in service. Harper's uniform had been packed away long ago, her medals stored in a box beneath her bed, gathering dust. But the weight of her service remained in her spine, in her knees, in the way she always checked for exits when entering a room, in the nightmares that hadn't quite faded. And yet, none of it seemed to count in the civilian world. She tried to shake it off, told herself it was just one moment, just one misunderstanding. But it wasn't the first. She remembered the time she was questioned at the pharmacy while picking up her veteran-prescribed medication, asked if the discount code she presented was really hers, or the time a neighbor commented that she didn't strike him as the military type, whatever that meant. She often wondered if it would be different if she still had the same crew cut she wore during her first tour, or if she walked around in camouflage or hung a flag from her car mirror. But that wasn't her style. She didn't need to prove anything. Or at least, she thought she didn't. Still, the ache of being unseen wore her down. That's when she decided she needed something to ground herself. She started volunteering at the local community center 2 blocks down from her apartment. There was a group there, mostly older veterans, Vietnam and Gulf War guys, who ran a mentorship circle for young people. Harper had walked in expecting to feel out of place, maybe even a little patronized. But instead, they welcomed her like she had always been part of their circle. No questions, no raised eyebrows, no qualifiers, just respect. She listened more than she spoke at first, but over time, they pulled her in. They saw her for who she was, an equal, a sister in arms, someone whose silence spoke volumes. They even asked about her tattoo. One of the older men, Marcus, recognized the falcon and dagger right away. Said he hadn't seen that mark in decades. His comment made her pause. Maybe more people knew the symbol than she thought. And maybe, just maybe, there were still places where that ink meant something more than an odd design to be judged. The world had changed, yes, but maybe not completely. Maybe it just needed a reminder. Harper didn't know that her reminder would come soon. And it wouldn't be in the quiet comfort of the community center. It would be in a place just as public and just as unassuming as that grocery store. But this time, it wouldn't be rejection waiting for her at the end of a checkout lane. It would be recognition, loud and undeniable. The days following the incident at the store unfolded like a quiet storm. Amelia didn't rush to tell anyone, not her friends, not her community, not even her family in the traditional sense. She simply returned to her small routine, tending to the plants around her home, quietly journaling, and walking every morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, as she had done for years. But inside her, something had shifted. That moment of humiliation, standing in her boots, in front of a teenage cashier who looked through her like she didn't matter, had reawakened something buried. Not rage, not revenge, but clarity. The quiet strength that had carried her through deployments and battles wasn't gone. It had just been dormant. Now it whispered again, reminding her that her story wasn't over, and her purpose wasn't diminished by age or circumstance. That day had not just reminded her of her invisibility, it had challenged her to question why she ever allowed it to take hold in the first place. The tattoo on her forearm, the one most people either avoided or stared at with confused reverence, had become more than just ink. It had become armor. And not for the first time, She found herself tracing the jagged lines with her fingertips, remembering the heat of the battlefield, the adrenaline of survival, and the blood oath she and her unit had made that day under enemy fire. Those who bore the mark were no longer civilians in any traditional sense. They were lifers, bonded by something far deeper than contract or deployment, by loss, resilience, and purpose. The ink wasn't there to intimidate, it was there to remind. And as Amelia sat on her porch one evening, her eyes settled on the horizon, glowing orange as the sun dipped behind the hills, she knew that the time for silence had passed. That weekend, she returned to the same supermarket. Not for confrontation, not for petty vindication, but because this was her town, this was her space. She had earned the right to walk every aisle with dignity, not tiptoe around her own legacy. But something had changed since her last visit. The whispers had grown louder in the community. Word had gotten around. Someone had seen the exchange that day. A young employee, perhaps, or maybe a customer. Either way, rumors began to form and twist like smoke around a flame. Some said she was a disgraced soldier impersonating a veteran. Others whispered that her tattoo meant she was blacklisted from military honors. Still others said she was just crazy, one of those ex-soldiers who never adjusted to civilian life. And while Amelia didn't concern herself with gossip, the tone in the air had shifted. People glanced more frequently. Some avoided her altogether. Others, especially the older men who sat outside the diner on Main Street, gave her longer looks, as though trying to recall something they couldn't quite place. That was when she received the first letter. It came in a plain envelope, slipped under her door, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly typed. "I know who you are. I saw the mark. We haven't forgotten. Some of us remember. Stand tall." There was no signature, but Amelia's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't the content alone that made her sit down slowly and read it again. It was the confirmation that someone had noticed, someone who understood. That letter wasn't just an encouragement, it was a signal, a flare in the dark, proof that the past had not completely buried her. And then came the visit. A black SUV pulled up to her driveway a few days later. From it stepped a man she hadn't seen in over a decade, General Malcolm Reyes. He was older now, with deep grooves in his cheeks and silver threaded through his buzzed hair. But his stance was the same, unyielding, deliberate. He approached slowly, but with purpose, and Amelia stood from her garden without hesitation, meeting him halfway, boots sinking slightly into the earth. No words were needed, not at first. They exchanged a silent nod, one forged in memory, in sacrifice, in respect. Eventually, they sat beneath the old oak in her yard, and he told her he'd heard about the incident. He said the mark on her arm had been spotted by one of his drivers, a young man who recognized the insignia, not from training manuals, but from whispered stories among elite units, the kind of stories that never made it to press releases or declassified briefings. Stories of a special task force that operated in shadows, whose members were both feared and forgotten, whose identities were scrubbed for their own protection. And he told her that in all his years of service, he had only seen that tattoo once, on the body of a soldier retrieved from an ambush in Kunar Province, a soldier who died protecting her unit while calling in air support under fire. That soldier had been one of Amelia's own. General Reyes said he had made some calls, not to stir trouble but to clarify facts. What he found disturbed him. Amelia's service file was inaccessible in all the usual ways. Flagged, obscured, mislabeled under a different division. It didn't make sense unless someone had intentionally hidden it. And that, he said, was something worth investigating. But more than that, Reyes looked her in the eye and told her she had been forgotten not by mistake, but by design. And it was time to change that. Not just for her, but for every soldier who had been erased for the convenience of political optics. And then he stood, offered her his hand, and asked if she'd consider speaking at an upcoming military ceremony. Amelia hesitated, not because she was unsure of her words, but because she had spent so long in silence, she had forgotten what it felt like to be heard. But she knew, deep in her marrow, that this was the beginning of something much bigger than herself. The next morning, Evelyn rose early, dressed in her neatly pressed olive jacket and dark jeans, and made her way downtown, gripping a copy of her resume with trembling hands. As she walked past the brick buildings and glass storefronts, she rehearsed her story silently, reminding herself that she was not there to beg for sympathy, but to earn a chance. She reached the recruiting office for Veterans Forward, a local nonprofit that helped transition veterans into civilian employment. She had read about them through a flyer tacked to a church bulletin board, and though skeptical of most outreach programs, something about this one felt grounded, personal. When she stepped inside, the waiting area was modest. Plastic chairs lined against neutral-colored walls and a coffee machine wheezing in the corner. A receptionist with kind eyes looked up and offered a warm nod. Evelyn took a seat and waited until her name was called. When she was invited into a back office, she met with a woman named Daria, a former Air Force intelligence officer turned workforce consultant. Daria scanned Evelyn's resume briefly, but her eyes lingered on her tattooed wrist, peeking from beneath her sleeve. Her brows lifted slightly. "You served in Desert Eagle Division?" she asked, in a voice that held both awe and caution. Evelyn simply nodded. Daria didn't press. Instead, she leaned back and said, "You know, I think I might know just the place for you, but it's unconventional." Evelyn didn't flinch at the word. Her entire life had been unconventional. Within the week, Evelyn was sitting across from the operations director of an antique security consulting firm that specialized in high-profile protective services. They were looking for someone with military background, someone with discretion and calm under pressure, and oddly enough, someone who didn't mind working irregular hours or traveling on short notice. Evelyn fit all of that. But still, she expected the skepticism to surface again, as it always did when they saw her age, her scars, her tired but steady eyes. Instead, the director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Janine, simply said, "I trust Daria's referrals. If she says you're worth it, you're worth it. When can you start?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Tomorrow," she said. And just like that, Evelyn began a new chapter. The transition was challenging. Civilian contracts were laced with politics, decorum, and a corporate pace she wasn't used to. But the work itself, securing logistics, protecting assets, staying alert in shadows, was something she instinctively understood. At night, she would go home and sit in her small apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator while sipping tea and reading reports. She wasn't sleeping much better, but she wasn't haunted as frequently either. The purpose was returning in quiet waves. Occasionally, during her work, people would glance at the tattoo on her inner wrist and look away quickly, as if recognizing something forbidden. The symbol, etched in black and deep crimson, was unmistakable to those who knew. The mark of the Black Echo Task Unit. Officially disbanded, unofficially disavowed. It was a division created for missions too sensitive to be publicly acknowledged, and its members were considered both myth and cautionary tale. Only a handful had survived their final classified deployment, and Evelyn was among them. She never spoke of it. But that tattoo, when seen by the right people, often changed the temperature in a room. One evening, Evelyn was assigned to a security detail for a gala in the city, a fundraiser attended by diplomats and military brass. She was stationed near the service entrance, scanning badges and ensuring protocol was followed. As she checked in a delivery group, a deep voice behind her asked if she could verify the clearance of one of the guests. She turned, expecting another staff member. Instead, she found herself staring into the steely blue eyes of a man she hadn't seen in 2 decades, General Corbin Thorne. He was older now, broader around the shoulders and grayer around the temples, but unmistakably the same leader who had once commanded the very division that Evelyn had belonged to. For a split second, neither of them spoke. His eyes drifted to her wrist where the cuff of her sleeve had slid up just enough for the ink to show. His expression shifted, not to surprise but to recognition laced with a rare kind of reverence. "Black Echo," he said under his breath, barely audible. Evelyn stood straighter. "Yes, sir." Corbin studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Follow me." She didn't ask questions. She followed. He led her to a quiet corner near the staircase, away from the hum of violins and the laughter of patrons. "I thought none of you made it out," he said. Evelyn looked past him at the chandeliers. "Most didn't." "You shouldn't be here," he said, though not as a reprimand. "You should be honored, not doing door security at a gala." Evelyn's voice was calm. "I go where I'm needed, sir." Corbin exhaled slowly, then pulled a card from his pocket. "Meet me Monday morning. Headquarters. I'll make sure the brass finally hears what they've tried so hard to forget. You did more for this country than they ever admitted." And with that, he turned and walked away. Evelyn stood still for a long while, her pulse steady, but her mind swimming with a strange blend of validation and dread. She wasn't sure if she wanted to be remembered, but in that moment, she knew she had been seen. Not just as a veteran, not just as a woman in uniform, but as someone who had endured the unendurable and survived. Mallory stood in the shower far longer than necessary that night, letting the hot water scald her skin as if it could wash away the memory of those prying eyes, the condescending smiles, and the cold absence of respect she had once earned without question. Hours had passed since the incident at the diner, but the sting clung to her like a second skin. The events replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. Her standing at the counter, offering her ID, watching the shift in the server's expression from pleasant neutrality to suspicion, and finally to dismissal. That tattoo, the insignia inked over her ribs, the very one that marked her as part of a classified division of the military, few dared to even speak of. It had always been her shield, her silent badge of honor. Until now. Now it was the thing that turned her into a pariah. The moment that young server caught a glimpse of it when she bent to grab her wallet, everything changed. Her tone, her stance, even the manager's sudden appearance. All of it felt orchestrated by fear, like she had brought danger with her rather than having once stood between danger and them. She had returned home trying to compose herself, brushing off her uncle's concern with a shrug and a lie about being tired. But she couldn't sleep. Not after that. Instead, she found herself seated at the edge of her bed in a towel, scrolling through old photos. Training shots. Deployment landscapes. The few rare selfies taken in the middle of nowhere with her unit. All of them gone now. Except for her and one other. The tattoo had been their unit symbol. A raven pierced by a lightning bolt, coiled around a compass. An emblem so distinct it wasn't meant to be seen by anyone outside the program. But in the heat of battle, in moments when armor failed and medics had to act fast, tattoos became the identifiers, silent warnings, signs that said, "Do not speak, do not share, do not ask." Her finger paused on a photo taken in the middle of the night under a sky bloated with stars. Her arm was around Jace, and they were both laughing, dirt on their faces, exhaustion in their eyes. He had died 3 months before her discharge. No body recovered. She blinked hard, placing the phone down. The sound of rain tapping the windows lulled her into a moment of stillness. That's when she heard the engine. A vehicle pulled up the gravel path behind her home. She froze. There were only 2 people who ever visited her. Her uncle and Mavis, the widow next door who brought over cinnamon rolls when she worried Mallory was forgetting to eat. But neither would arrive this late. She slid into a pair of sweatpants and a loose hoodie, her body on autopilot as she reached into the drawer where she kept her service pistol, still locked in its box. Instinct and caution, 2 things that had never left her training. She peeked out the curtain and spotted a black government SUV, the kind she'd seen hundreds of times outside bases and secure facilities. Her heartbeat slowed in a different way now, cool and steady. She opened the door before the knock came. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was a man she hadn't seen in nearly a decade, General Thomas Vance, the very man who had recruited her. His once dark hair was streaked with more gray than she remembered, and his frame was a touch heavier, but his presence was unshaken. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at her, eyes flickering from her face to the tattoo that peeked slightly from the edge of her hoodie's collarbone. Then, he nodded. She didn't ask him how he knew. She didn't ask why he was there. She simply stepped aside and let him in. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound between them the ticking of the wall clock and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he spoke. Told her he'd heard about the diner. That someone who shouldn't have recognized the tattoo did, and that word spread fast. That some people still feared what they couldn't control. That her presence in public, especially after what happened in Syria, was making some in Washington uneasy. Her eyes narrowed. So this wasn't just about a restaurant. This was about a lid someone was trying to keep tightly sealed. He confirmed it with a quiet nod. She was a reminder. Of operations that had been sanctioned but never acknowledged. Of actions taken in the name of peace that would never make it into the public archives. Of collateral damage in blurred lines and blacked-out pages. She asked him if they were here to silence her. His laugh was short and dry. No, he said. He was here to ask her a favor. Something she never thought she'd hear again. A favor from the very institution that had let her go without ceremony, whose silence during her discharge had said more than any medal ever could. There was a rising tide of chatter online, he explained. A leak, likely unintentional, was about to blow the cover off their division's work. Some images had surfaced, ones where her tattoo was visible, even partially. Conspiracy theorists were already spiraling into theories. The agency wanted to get ahead of it. They needed someone to be the face, the reluctant hero, the human behind the mystery. Not a spokesperson, not a soldier, just someone real, she scoffed. This wasn't redemption. This was manipulation. A move to use her image to control the narrative before it exploded. She told him to leave. He stood, understanding in his eyes. But as he reached the door, he paused and said, "Not everyone's afraid of the tattoo. Some of us still remember what it meant." And then he was gone, the SUV swallowed again by the rain. She locked the door behind him, her thoughts whirling. She could walk away. She could let the world speculate and protect her peace. But then again, when had she ever done the easy thing? Her fingers brushed the edge of the tattoo, feeling the ridges of ink over scar. This wasn't just a mark of her past. It was a part of her story that no one had ever asked to hear, until now. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they did. The moment the bus rolled into Rockford, there was a strange quietness that settled in Naomi's chest. Not a silence of peace, but something taut and uncertain. She stepped off with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a deep breath pushed through her nose. The streets looked smaller than she remembered, more worn down somehow, or maybe that was just her view after being away. She hadn't been back since before the deployment, before she lost her unit, and before her world had split into the before and after. Her boots felt heavier as they hit the ground, not from weight, but from what she carried inside. She had always imagined coming home would feel like some kind of healing, like the earth here would wrap her up and whisper, "It's over now." But it didn't. The town just carried on, like she'd never left. People walked past her with coffees in hand, and dogs on leashes, the sun catching on windshields and storefront windows. And it all looked so normal it made her feel like an outsider in her own life. She'd come back, not for nostalgia or peace, but for a reason. Her sister Grace had left 3 voicemails, the kind that sounded breezy on the surface but carried a crackling edge of urgency Naomi couldn't ignore. And beneath that was the simple truth. She had nowhere else to go. The base didn't want her anymore. The Army had processed her discharge and handed her a folder, a thank you, and a ride to the terminal. That was it. 12 years of service closed, like a chapter no one wanted to read anymore. She walked the familiar 2 blocks from the bus stop to Grace's townhouse, the sight of the faded mailbox and chipped garden gnome out front, striking her with a wave of memories she didn't know she had. When Grace opened the door, she looked startled for a second, her hair wet, a toddler clinging to one leg, and a phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. Then she smiled wide, the kind of smile that tried to stitch the years together like no time had passed. Naomi didn't return the smile, but she stepped forward and hugged her. It felt stiff, but real. Over the next few days, Naomi settled into the spare bedroom that doubled as a laundry overflow and toy storage space. Grace tried her best to ease her in gently, offering coffee in the mornings, asking harmless questions, letting silence do the rest. But Naomi was quiet, withdrawn. The noise of the world, the television, the neighbor's dog, the laughter from the playground nearby, it all felt too loud and yet too far away. She started going on early morning runs to burn through the anxiety. She ran through the neighborhood with her hoodie up and music in her ears, pretending she could leave the restlessness behind with each mile. But no matter how far she ran, she always circled back to the same question: what now? Then came the day at the pharmacy. Grace had asked her to pick up cough medicine and diapers while she worked late. Naomi didn't think much of it. She grabbed the bag, waited in line, and handed over her ID. She mentioned, casually, out of habit more than anything, that she was a veteran. The cashier was young, maybe 20, chewing gum and looking half bored. He squinted at her. "Do you have proof? Like a card or something?" Naomi pulled out her discharge papers from her wallet. "This is from the Army itself." He shrugged. "We need something that says veteran discount on it." Behind her, people began to shift impatiently in line. Naomi's throat tightened. She kept her voice low. "I served 12 years. I was honorably discharged 3 weeks ago. I have shrapnel still healing in my shoulder. That should be enough." The cashier blinked, unmoved. "Store policy. Sorry." He didn't sound sorry. She could feel her face burning, not from embarrassment, but from the deep well of shame and anger and helplessness she kept trying to bury. And then someone behind her cleared their throat, a deep, commanding sound. Naomi turned to see a man in full dress uniform, ribbons lined across his chest, silver stars glinting at his shoulders. He looked maybe 60, but his eyes were sharp, and his presence seemed to still the entire pharmacy. He stepped forward, nodding at Naomi, then turned to the cashier. "This woman doesn't need a card. That tattoo on her wrist is all the proof anyone should ever need." Naomi glanced down, almost reflexively. The ink had faded over time, but the symbol was unmistakable. Her unit's emblem, the one the enemy feared because of what they survived, because of who they were. The cashier blinked, stunned silent. The general, because there was no mistaking what he was, turned to Naomi and said, "Come with me." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Something was shifting. Not just in the room, but in the air around her, like the needle of a compass that had finally found north. Naomi followed, unsure of what was happening, but suddenly feeling, for the first time in months, like maybe her story wasn't done yet. By the time morning light began to stretch over the horizon, casting long gold beams over the pavement and glinting off the dew-kissed windshields, Marisol was already seated on the edge of her bed, lacing her boots with the precise, almost reverent rhythm she'd never let go of since her days in the service. The events at the depot hadn't just shaken her, they had reawakened something buried beneath layers of civilian routine and societal dismissal. The tattoo that had always pulsed quietly on her skin like a muted battle cry now throbbed with the memory of honor, sacrifice, and command. And today, she was no longer going to let herself be just another forgotten soldier in a sea of overlooked heroes. She had somewhere to be. The call from General Rourke's assistant had come shortly after midnight, a brief message confirming that the general wanted to see her, not at some public function, but at Fort Columbia itself, the base that had once been her proving ground and personal crucible. The same base where she'd trained, bled, and carved her name into legend, though only those with clearance remembered that now. That morning, the base was already humming with life when Marisol drove through the guarded checkpoint. The young MP at the gate didn't recognize her name at first, even with her ID. It wasn't until she rolled up her sleeve and revealed the ink, the unmistakable mark of Task Unit Tempest, that his posture straightened and his tone shifted from bored protocol to stiff respect. He waved her through with wide eyes and a stammered, "Welcome back, Sergeant." The road leading through the base brought back a cascade of memories, some triumphant, others burdened with the weight of what she'd left behind. She passed the mess hall where her unit had once scrawled their names beneath a bench they deemed lucky. She passed the armory, the barracks, and finally, the administrative building, where a sharply dressed aide escorted her through a maze of hallways until they arrived at a door guarded not by rank, but by silence. The office of General Rourke. Inside, the general didn't rise when she entered. Instead, he looked up from a folder on his desk, narrowed his eyes as if seeing her not with his sight, but with his memory. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, and walked around the desk to face her. His voice was quiet when he spoke, laced with something between pride and remorse. "Marisol Vega," he said, letting her name hang in the air like a salute. "We thought we'd lost you." She hadn't expected to feel anything, but those words cracked through the stoicism she'd worn like armor. She nodded, jaw tight. "I walked away. It felt like I had to." The general gestured for her to sit, and as she did, he slid the open folder across the desk to face her. Inside were photos, grainy, black and white stills, time-stamped and classified, yet hauntingly familiar. Recon missions, night operations, close-quarters extractions, her work, her legacy. You didn't just serve, Vega, you led. Task Unit Tempest wasn't just a name, you turned it into a myth. We've got young recruits asking about the stories, about the woman with the ink and the radio calls that saved entire teams. She blinked down at the photos, her throat thickening. It was strange, almost disorienting, to see her past documented, honored, preserved. She'd grown so used to being erased that this felt like discovering a grave someone had tended in secret. "Why now?" she asked finally. "Why call me in after all this time?" The general leaned back, his expression shifting into something unreadable. "Because you deserve to know that your silence hasn't meant you were forgotten. And because yesterday, at that hardware store, someone tried to treat one of our best like she didn't matter." "That," he said, his voice sharpening, "will not stand." He went on to explain that the man who'd denied her discount was a new hire with no training in military protocol. But what concerned the general more wasn't the man's ignorance. It was the fact that a system had allowed her service, her sacrifice, to be so easily dismissed. That wasn't just a failure of manners. It was a failure of memory, of gratitude, of the very values they claimed to uphold. Then, as she listened in stunned silence, Rourke offered her something unexpected. Not a medal, not a speech, but a role. A new one. A civilian liaison at the base. A position designed to support transition programs for veterans, particularly women, and to ensure that the stories of Task Unit Tempest didn't fade into myth without proper recognition. "We need someone who's lived it," he said, "who knows what it feels like to serve and then be invisible. You could shape the next generation and remind this one what service truly looks like." The weight of the offer settled over her slowly, not crushing but grounding. It wasn't just about a job. It was about stepping back into a purpose she thought she'd forfeited. It was about reclaiming her narrative, not through medals or mentions, but through impact. When she left the base that afternoon, The tattoo on her arm burned in the sun, no longer hidden. She didn't roll down her sleeve. She let it show. And as she passed the gates once more, the same MP saluted her without hesitation. For the first time in years, she saluted back, not as a habit, but as a promise. As the days unfolded after that life-altering visit to the diner, Mallory noticed something she hadn't expected. People were reaching out. The video had spread across the country faster than a wildfire. She was getting letters, emails, and messages from people she had never met, veterans and civilians alike. Some thanked her for her service, others shared their own stories of being overlooked or judged too quickly, and more than a few expressed outrage at how she had been treated by the staff at the diner. What began as a humiliating moment in her hometown had morphed into something far greater, something oddly empowering. Despite her desire to remain out of the spotlight, she understood that her story had become bigger than her. In a way, it no longer belonged to just her. It belonged to every veteran who had been forgotten, every woman in uniform who had been doubted, every person who had ever had to prove they were worthy. The tattoo General Braddock had recognized, once a symbol of a mission shrouded in silence and secrecy, was now a conversation starter, a symbol of a movement. Mallory didn't think of herself as brave, though others certainly did. She had faced danger overseas, but none of that had required as much vulnerability as speaking up did now. She agreed to do a few interviews, always with the condition that the focus remain on the broader treatment of veterans rather than on her own accolades. She didn't want to be a hero in the media's eyes. She wanted to help other veterans feel seen and heard. In one interview, when asked what hurt most about the diner incident, she said simply, "It wasn't the denial of a discount. It was the assumption that I didn't belong to the group I gave everything for. It was being looked at like I was a liar." That quote made headlines. It resonated deeply with audiences far and wide. Meanwhile, the diner's owners were under increasing pressure. Protests had been staged outside the establishment. Local news crews set up temporary stations outside their doors, and footage of empty tables and sullen employees had gone viral as quickly as the original confrontation. Even though General Braddock had made a public statement encouraging forgiveness and understanding, urging the public not to destroy the diner but to learn from the event, the damage had been done. Eventually, the owners issued a formal apology. It was long, carefully worded, and delivered with trembling voices. They admitted that their assumptions had been rooted in ignorance and bias, and they pledged to make meaningful changes in how their business treated veterans and customers in general. But Mallory wasn't interested in retribution. She never was. When the apology was aired, she nodded quietly, accepting it with the quiet dignity she had always carried. She didn't want the diner shut down. She didn't want anyone to lose their jobs. What she had wanted all along was respect. And now, in a strange full-circle moment, she had not only earned it, she had inspired a community to reflect on how it treats its own. In the days that followed, Mallory returned to her quiet routines. She started volunteering at a local veterans center that offered counseling and reintegration programs. There, she found herself connecting with others who had stories of being dismissed or unseen, and she poured herself into helping them feel the belonging she herself had once lost. Her presence alone gave comfort to many, especially the younger women who were unsure if they'd ever be seen for their courage instead of questioned for their appearances. One afternoon, Mallory received a package in the mail without a return address. Inside was a carefully folded American flag and a handwritten note. The note read, "Your courage off the battlefield may be your greatest act of service yet. Thank you for reminding us what quiet strength looks like." There was no signature, just a simple drawing of an eagle in the corner, an insignia only a few would recognize. Mallory smiled, her fingers tracing the lines of the drawing. She knew exactly who had sent it, and she whispered a quiet thanks into the stillness of her living room. Life didn't change overnight. The wounds Mallory carried didn't magically heal, because people finally saw her. But she no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like she had to walk, with her shoulders hunched, and her voice muted. She had earned her space in the world many times over, and finally, the world seemed ready to give it to her. And in doing so, they hadn't just restored her faith. They had ignited a fire in communities across the nation, to reevaluate their own biases, their own assumptions, and the quiet ways in which they might be overlooking those who had given everything. Even as the media attention faded and new stories took its place, Mallory remained steady in her purpose. She never asked for the spotlight, but now that it had passed through her life, she was determined to ensure it left something behind. In her small, consistent ways, through volunteer work, mentorship, and listening, she became a lighthouse for others, a quiet beacon reminding people that valor doesn't always come with medals or parades. Sometimes it comes with silence, with patience, and with a tattoo that no one dares speak of, until someone finally does. The days that followed brought a storm of attention unlike anything Madeline had ever expected. What started as a confrontation at a hardware store escalated into something much larger: a national conversation, news coverage, radio interviews, and military veterans from all over the country reaching out in solidarity. But the most unexpected change happened quietly, away from the spotlight. General Carver didn't just shake her hand that day and walk away. He stayed involved. Madeline found herself in a position she'd never imagined, being invited to a closed-door meeting at the Capitol to speak about veteran discrimination, especially toward female service members. At first, she hesitated. She was never one for politics or public speaking. She was more comfortable lifting engine parts or instructing new recruits during boot camp drills. But Carver insisted, not because she had to prove anything, but because her story had a weight that cut through the noise. In his words, she was the face of every quiet warrior who's ever been overlooked. Madeline sat in a mahogany-paneled room filled with lawmakers, military brass, and advocates. Her heart pounded, but she carried with her the memory of the young boy in the store, watching her with wide eyes, the echo of the cashier's dismissive voice, and the soft touch of Carver's hand gripping hers after spotting her tattoo. She told them everything: the skepticism she'd faced even while in uniform, the disrespect in civilian life, the endless questioning of her worth, even with medals on her wall. And then she made it personal. She told them about her fallen unit, about why she got the tattoo in the first place, not for recognition but to remember. To carry the ghosts with her, not as a burden but as a quiet promise to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Several representatives sat back in their chairs, blinking hard. One woman near the front clutched her chest with both hands. Carver, sitting off to the side, simply gave her the smallest nod, as if to say, "That's it, that's why we needed you here." In the weeks that followed, several initiatives were launched. One was a push for better training and sensitivity awareness among retailers offering military discounts. Another was a broader campaign aimed at honoring the stories of female veterans across all branches, making sure their contributions weren't buried in the shadows. Madeline didn't seek a spotlight, but it followed her. She was interviewed on national television, featured in military publications, and even asked to help design a new program connecting transitioning female service members to mentors and resources. Yet through it all, she remained grounded in her roots. She still helped her neighbors with car repairs. She still visited the VA hospital every week, not as a patient, but as a friend. She spent quiet mornings at the cemetery talking to her old comrades. The tattoo on her forearm had become more than a symbol. It was a banner that brought others out of silence. Strangers would stop her and lift their sleeves to reveal matching ink, stories, and pain. Some would hug her, others would cry. One young girl, barely 17, told her she was inspired to enlist, not because of the Army commercials, but because of Madeline's strength. And then one day, Madeline received an invitation she never saw coming. The president was honoring select veterans during the National Medal of Valor ceremony, and she was among them. When she walked up the White House steps, her boots clicked against the stone floor, just as they did in the barracks long ago. She stood tall, shoulders back, heart racing. When her name was called, there was a hush. And then, thunderous applause. Not because of one viral video, not because of one general's words, but because her story, one woman's battle for recognition in a world that often ignored her kind of service, struck a chord that could no longer be unheard. Back in South Haven, the hardware store underwent changes too. New management, new policies, and a visible pledge on their window vowing support and respect to all veterans, regardless of appearance or gender. The cashier, who once denied her the discount, wasn't seen again, but Madeline bore no grudge. In truth, she'd stopped thinking about that incident with anger. It had become something else entirely, a catalyst, a door that opened to 1,000 others. Her life hadn't just returned to normal, it had evolved. She now received handwritten letters from women stationed overseas, mothers who served in silence, and even young boys who saw strength in something different from what they'd been taught. Strength in patience, strength in grace under fire, strength in not needing to shout to be heard. But the most meaningful moment came one quiet Sunday morning, standing in her garage beside a rusted motorcycle she'd been working on for weeks. A teenage girl and her father approached, the girl wearing an oversized military jacket and eyes full of questions. Her father, a veteran himself, said, "My daughter wants to know if you're the one with the tattoo, the one who didn't back down." Madeline looked at the girl and smiled. She rolled up her sleeve and showed her the mark, worn but proud. The girl reached out and traced it with a trembling finger. "I want to be brave like you," she whispered. And just like that, Madeline knew the journey was far from over. The fight for visibility, for fairness, for honor, it didn't end with speeches or medals. It lived in these moments, passed from one hand to another, one story at a time. As the ceremony concluded, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Elena stood still for a long while, her gaze lingering on the bronze plaque now embedded near the entrance of the Capitol building. Her name was etched beneath the words, "Valor Beyond Measure," a tribute she never sought but accepted now with quiet dignity. The sun was dipping lower, casting golden light across the marble steps and illuminating her silhouette like a sentinel watching over a legacy forged through pain, resilience, and service. General Branson had given her the final nod of approval, but even more than that, he had unlocked something she had kept guarded for years, a renewed belief in herself not just as a soldier, but as a woman who mattered in the fabric of her country's story. But in the days following the ceremony, Elena found herself struggling with what came next. She had spent the better part of her adult life defined by missions, commands, and objectives. She had never paused long enough to ask who she was beyond her uniform. The viral video and news coverage had sparked a wave of public support, and her inbox flooded with interview requests, book deals, and even appearances at military conventions. She declined most of them, unsure if she was ready to be the face of anything again. Her life had never been about fanfare, and while she was grateful for the attention on veterans' issues, she didn't want to become someone else's brand. What she did accept, however, was the invitation to speak at a high school career day in a small town about 2 hours outside of Lexington. It wasn't a big city or a glitzy stage, but something about the invitation felt pure and grounded. The letter had come handwritten, from a student named Kylie Jacobs, whose father had served in the same unit Elena once trained under. Kylie had written about her dreams of becoming a military nurse, and how Elena's story had inspired her to keep pushing, despite the bullying she endured for being too soft to join the service. Elena packed light for the trip, taking only what she needed: her old boots, a faded photo of her unit, and the patch sewn into the sleeve of her last combat uniform. She drove the distance alone, windows down, letting the late spring wind roll through her hair. The road was quiet, dotted with green fields and rusted mailboxes. It felt miles away from anything ceremonial, and she liked it that way. When she arrived at the school gymnasium, she didn't expect the turnout. Over 200 students sat in the bleachers, buzzing with energy. Banners reading, quote, "Welcome Captain Elena Ramirez," hung across the stage, and Kylie herself stood near the podium, wringing her hands nervously. Elena walked straight up to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, "You've already done something brave by asking me here." Kylie beamed, her nerves melting into awe. When Elena finally stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. She began not with war stories or medals, but with the day she stood at the checkout counter, denied a discount meant for people like her. She told them how small that moment had made her feel, how invisible she had become despite years of sacrifice. She described the tattoo, how it was never meant to be a symbol of fear, but of belonging, memory, and loyalty. And then she spoke about healing, not just the kind that comes from medicine or time, but the healing that comes when others finally see you, hear you, and say, "You still matter." Her voice didn't waver once. She spoke plainly, honestly, with the same conviction that once guided her through fire zones and surgeries. By the time she finished, not a single student looked at her the same way. They didn't just see a soldier. They saw a woman who had been broken and rebuilt, not into the same shape, but into something stronger. Afterwards, students lined up to thank her, ask questions, and share their own stories. One boy told her he had lost his brother in Afghanistan and never talked about it until today. Another girl said she was no longer afraid of being misunderstood if she chose a non-traditional path. Elena stayed for hours, shaking hands, offering words, hugging tearful teenagers who clung to her like she was the anchor they didn't know they needed. On her way out, Kylie ran up with a small box. Inside was a lanyard with "Future Nurse" embroidered on it, and a dog tag engraved with Elena's initials. "For luck," Kylie said. Elena tucked the tag into her pocket without a word, her heart full. That night she didn't return to Lexington. Instead, she booked a small cabin in the woods and let herself rest. For the first time in years, there were no patrols, no schedules, no layers of armor. Just trees, stars, and the knowledge that somewhere in the world, a teenage girl had decided to keep going because of her. It wasn't the battlefield, but it was still a victory. Despite the firestorm that had been ignited and quelled in a matter of weeks, the dust had not entirely settled around Cassandra. The country may have come to see her as a quiet hero, gritty, principled, humble, but she remained withdrawn from the attention, as though the glow of spotlight might somehow wash away the private sanctity of her convictions. Still, life outside of the controversy had to resume. The barista who had refused her discount had long since resigned, and the coffee chain, in an act of corporate damage control, issued a formal apology, pledged new military-friendly initiatives, and even offered Cassandra a permanent gold membership card. She accepted none of it. To her, the point had never been about free coffee. It had been about principle, about the silent acknowledgement of sacrifice, and no latte or PR campaign could patch over the deeper truth she had experienced. Meanwhile, General Rutherford had returned to base, but not to obscurity. He'd been seen on talk shows, in congressional meetings, and at military academies, giving speeches on identity, quiet valor, and how prejudice often wears a polite smile. Cassandra kept in touch with him only sporadically. Brief texts of gratitude, sometimes an article link, never seeking or encouraging more contact than necessary. He had respected that boundary, and in doing so earned even more of her quiet regard. One cold Tuesday morning, Cassandra sat on the back porch of her modest home in the outskirts of Asheville, wrapped in a wool shawl and sipping tea as the mist hovered low over the distant tree line. Her husband Daniel had taken the kids to school, and she welcomed these brief windows of silence where her thoughts could wander or rest without demand. The tattoo on her arm, now infamous to the world but deeply personal to her, was no longer hidden. The swirling eagle with the number 13 etched beneath its wing had always drawn glances from veterans who knew, from service members who guessed, but now it bore an entirely different weight. No longer just a silent memory of her fallen unit, it had become a symbol for countless others who felt invisible in their service, whether because of gender, status, or the stories they carried but never shared. And yet, with that recognition came complexity. Cassandra had begun receiving letters, hundreds of them. Some were from women who'd served in silence like her, now emboldened to speak up. Others were from men who admitted they'd never considered what it meant for a mother of two to survive frontline duties, to lead in a hostile zone, to return not with accolades but with silence. The letters that struck her most, though, were from teenagers, mostly girls, who said they now wanted to serve because of her. That thought both humbled and frightened her. Service was not a decision to be made from admiration alone. It required grit, resilience, and a readiness to be reshaped in the crucible of conflict. Cassandra found herself torn between encouraging their spirit and reminding them of the harshness behind the uniform. Meanwhile, an unexpected opportunity arose. A small, independent documentary team had approached her, inspired not by the media frenzy, but by the underlying story of identity and sacrifice that hadn't been fully explored. They wanted to follow her through a quiet journey, not flashbacks of war zones or viral moments, but the stillness of life after, the routines of family, the gravity of memory. She said no at first, hesitant to open her world to interpretation, to editing. But Daniel, always her anchor, gently asked her, "What if your silence now does the opposite of what you want? What if sharing a sliver helps someone feel seen?" So she agreed, with conditions. The filming would remain low profile, no dramatizations, no reenactments, just her truth, in her space, as she lived it. When the crew arrived weeks later, they were respectful and minimal. A young woman director named Malia, leading the interviews with a calm presence that reminded Cassandra of herself when she first enlisted, curious, steady, unshaken by surface chaos. They recorded Cassandra's days, helping her youngest with algebra, organizing a local food drive, visiting a VA center not as a speaker but as a listener. But it was one evening conversation that became the documentary's core. Cassandra, seated on her porch again, the twilight casting long shadows across her hands, spoke of the tattoo. She described the last mission, the lost friends, the weight she carried not just from survival, but from erasure. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked just slightly on the word, forgotten. And then she smiled, soft and fierce. "But I'm not invisible anymore. Not because someone famous said so. Because I decided not to be." When the film was quietly released months later, it did not go viral in the traditional sense. It wasn't a trending TikTok or a headline on gossip sites. But it made its way into military family groups, veteran circles, feminist panels, and high school classrooms. It became a quiet anthem, the way an old ballad seeps into generations not because of its volume, but because of its resonance. Cassandra received invitations to speak, to write, to lead. She accepted only a few, careful always to prioritize her family, her peace. Still, each time she took the mic or penned a reflection, the audience leaned in, not to be dazzled, but to understand. The journey from dismissal to dignity was not linear, and she never pretended it was. Part 14 ended, not with a dramatic climax, but with a sense of quiet rising, a wave building slowly, not to crash, but to carry. Cassandra no longer needed permission to be recognized. She had earned her place not just in public narrative, but in the hearts of those who knew how much could live behind a simple tattoo, and how dangerous silence could be when truth deserved a voice. The medal pinned to her chest that day wasn't just a symbol of duty fulfilled or protocol acknowledged. It was a mirror reflecting every scar, sacrifice, and silent battle Cassandra had endured. As she stood under the soaring flag at Fort Baxter, sunlight casting a soft glow on the newly unveiled bronze plaque etched with her name, the base fell into a respectful hush. This wasn't a routine ceremony. It was a collective reckoning. In every direction, there were eyes that once overlooked her now, brimming with admiration, guilt, and an awakening sense of gratitude. General Stratton's presence on that stage wasn't merely to honor her. It was a signal to everyone watching that this nation still recognized integrity, even when the world tried to bury it under bias and bureaucracy. And when he saluted her, he didn't just salute a soldier, he saluted a survivor. The woman who had once been dismissed as, quote, just another discount-seeking customer, had now been immortalized in the very halls where decisions about defense, dignity, and duty were made. The days following the ceremony were surreal. The news had picked up the story, first as a viral clip titled "The Woman with the Feared Tattoo," and then as a full-on segment broadcast nationally. Interview requests flooded in. Her inbox overflowed with messages from strangers, fellow veterans, daughters of forgotten soldiers, even civilians, each sharing their own stories of being unseen. Cassandra read them all, sometimes in tears, sometimes with a soft smile. Each letter was like a voice in a once silent choir, now finding harmony through her stand. Yet, even amid the flood of newfound attention, she stayed grounded. It wasn't about fame. It never had been. It was about truth, legacy, and rewriting the narrative for every woman, every soldier who had ever been told she wasn't enough. Back in that same small-town hardware store, things had changed. The owner issued a public apology after footage from the security cameras showed the uncomfortable exchange. Apparently, someone had sent it to the press. Whether it was the clerk himself, racked with shame, or a remorseful onlooker, no one ever found out. But the impact was clear. The store implemented military training for its staff, not just to recognize discounts, but to understand the people behind them. A small plaque near the register now read, "We see you, we thank you." It was subtle, but to Cassandra, it meant the world. She returned there once, months later, to pick up a few tools. This time, she wore a simple, long-sleeve shirt, not to hide the tattoo, but to keep the moment hers. The same young man who had once questioned her credentials rang her up silently, his eyes locked on hers the entire time. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His quiet nod as he handed her the receipt was apology enough. As for the tattoo, it had taken on a new life. What had once been feared and misunderstood now became a symbol for a new movement, one that advocated for better recognition and support for veterans, especially women, upon returning home. Cassandra partnered with other service members to establish the Inked Valor Foundation, an organization that not only offered legal support and outreach programs for veterans, but also collected their stories, tattoo by tattoo. They'd started with 50 portraits, each capturing the tale behind the ink. By the end of the first year, they had over 2,000 submissions. Each one was a testament to endurance, to memory, to a generation refusing to be erased. Ethan stood by her through all of it. Though their relationship had never been defined by grand gestures, there was a quiet devotion between them now that no one could mistake. He built her a small studio in their backyard, a place where she could work, think, write, and sometimes just be. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her from the porch, coffee in hand, a peaceful smile on his face, and she'd remember that long day when he'd simply stood beside her in silence outside the store. That moment had been the seed for everything that followed. On the anniversary of her final mission, the one that had nearly ended her life and marked her forever, she stood before her team's memorial, surrounded by a new generation of recruits. She spoke not about warfare or victory, but about memory, about being overlooked, and about rising anyway. Her voice was steady, her message clear. You do not need permission to be proud of your service. You do not need validation to know your worth. And you certainly do not need to hide the parts of you that carry pain, because pain is proof you survived. The medal pinned to her chest that day wasn't just a symbol of duty fulfilled or protocol acknowledged. It was a mirror, reflecting every scar, sacrifice, and silent battle Cassandra had endured. As she stood under the soaring flag at Fort Baxter, sunlight casting a soft glow on the newly unveiled bronze plaque etched with her name, the base fell into a respectful hush. This wasn't a routine ceremony. It was a collective reckoning. In every direction there were eyes that once overlooked her, now brimming with admiration, guilt, and an awakening sense of gratitude. General Stratton's presence on that stage wasn't merely to honor her. It was a signal to everyone watching that this nation still recognized integrity, even when the world tried to bury it under bias and bureaucracy. And when he saluted her, he didn't just salute a soldier, he saluted a survivor. The woman who had once been dismissed as just another discount-seeking customer had now been immortalized in the very halls where decisions about defense, dignity, and duty were made. The days following the ceremony were surreal. The news had picked up the story, first as a viral clip titled, "The Woman with the Feared Tattoo," and then as a full-on segment broadcast nationally. Interview requests flooded in. Her inbox overflowed with messages from strangers, fellow veterans, daughters of forgotten soldiers, even civilians, each sharing their own stories of being unseen. Cassandra read them all, sometimes in tears, sometimes with a soft smile. Each letter was like a voice in a once silent choir, now finding harmony through her stand. Yet, even amid the flood of newfound attention, she stayed grounded. It wasn't about fame. It never had been. It was about truth, legacy, and rewriting the narrative for every woman, every soldier who had ever been told she wasn't enough. Back in that same small-town hardware store, things had changed. The owner issued a public apology after footage from the security cameras showed the uncomfortable exchange. Apparently, someone had sent it to the press. Whether it was the clerk himself, racked with shame, or a remorseful onlooker, no one ever found out. But the impact was clear. The store implemented military training for its staff, not just to recognize discounts, but to understand the people behind them. A small plaque near the register now read, "We see you. We thank you." It was subtle, but to Cassandra it meant the world. She returned there once, months later, to pick up a few tools. This time, she wore a simple long-sleeve shirt, not to hide the tattoo, but to keep the moment hers. The same young man, who had once questioned her credentials, rang her up silently, his eyes locked on hers the entire time. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His quiet nod, as he handed her the receipt, was apology enough. As for the tattoo, it had taken on a new life. What had once been feared and misunderstood now became a symbol for a new movement, one that advocated for better recognition and support for veterans, especially women, upon returning home. Cassandra partnered with other service members to establish the Inked Valor Foundation, an organization that not only offered legal support and outreach programs for veterans, but also collected their stories, tattoo by tattoo. They'd started with 50 portraits, each capturing the tale behind the ink. By the end of the first year, they had over 2,000 submissions. Each one was a testament to endurance, to memory, to a generation refusing to be erased. Ethan stood by her through all of it. Though their relationship had never been defined by grand gestures, there was a quiet devotion between them now that no one could mistake. He built her a small studio in their backyard, a place where she could work, think, write, and sometimes just be. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her from the porch, coffee in hand, a peaceful smile on his face, and she'd remember that long day when he'd simply stood beside her in silence outside the store. That moment had been the seed for everything that followed. On the anniversary of her final mission, the one that had nearly ended her life and marked her forever, she stood before her team's memorial, surrounded by a new generation of recruits. She spoke not about warfare or victory, but about memory, about being overlooked, and about rising anyway. Her voice was steady, her message clear. You do not need permission to be proud of your service. You do not need validation to know your worth. And you certainly do not need to hide the parts of you that carry pain, because pain is proof you survived. And with that, she unbuttoned her sleeve and rolled it up slowly, revealing the serpent and dagger tattoo, still stark against her skin, still whispering stories to those who dared look closer. A hushed reverence fell over the crowd, not of fear, but of awe. She had taken what was feared and turned it into power. What was shunned had become sacred. As the wind carried the last notes of the national anthem through the base, Cassandra turned to leave, her silhouette strong, unwavering, a symbol not of rebellion, but of remembrance, resilience, and rebirth. The woman who once stood in line for a discount had now etched her story into the nation's heart, and no one would ever forget her again.